Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you on this Baptism of the Lord Sunday. Blessings and congratulations again to Henry and to his family on this special day. And thanks to Jim for filling in for me last week as I was under the weather. I'm grateful for that, Jim. Not quite the last minute of writing a sermon, but it was pretty close. On the upside, I have a sermon for next year's Epiphany Sunday already written, so we're good to go. Couple things just to note. On Wednesday evening, we'll begin a 2-week little kind of introduction to the Bible. Be this Wednesday and then the Wednesday following. I believe that's the 15th and the 22nd. And that'll be upstairs. I'll be teaching that upstairs in the new Seymour building. And then following that, on Sunday the 26th, we begin our church-wide book study of Magre de Vega's little book, Questions Jesus Asked. And it's focused, each chapter is focused around a question that Jesus asked in the Gospels. So for 6 weeks, we'll reflect on that. And I'll also be teaching the book on Wednesday nights as a kind of follow-up to the sermon. So if you're not in a small group or just want to come and study, read together, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and join us for that. If someone asked you, how would you define who you are? For several years, and I may have shared this with you before, Kim and I, when our daughters were in high school, Kim and I worked as a part of the concessions team for all the athletic events at the high school. And in those days, in those moments, we were known almost exclusively as Salem's mom and dad and Abby's mom and dad. Very few people knew our names, but they knew the kids that belonged to us. We were defined by our children. Children are often defined by their parents, by who they belong to, or their birth order, the oldest, the youngest. You may define yourself by what you do, by how you earn a living or earned a living in your career. Your identity may be connected to a title, as mine is, pastor or doctor or teacher, professor, accountant. It's interesting to see on social media how people define themselves, the words and the images that they use to say very publicly, this is who I am. Others describe themselves through their affiliation with a group or an area of the country, conservative or liberal, southerner, northerner, midwesterner. And some have, unfortunately, a very negative sense of identity, believing that they're unpopular or unworthy or never enough. So who are you? And I don't mean in the kind of superficial way that we often define ourselves, but at the core of your being, who are you? When all else is set aside, how would you let someone know this is who I am? The things we do, where we live, what we have, our family, our level of education, our career, they're all parts of our identity, parts of who we are. But today, as we begin this new year together, I'm concerned with what lies underneath all of that, with our most central and defining identity. Because how we understand who we are, how we see ourselves, it shapes how we live, it shapes how we perceive the world and how we treat others. Now, I'm aware as we ask this question and reflect on our identity that some have claimed or made an identity for themselves. It's carefully curated. They've worked hard at manufacturing an identity that they want others to see. It may or may not be the truth about who they are, but it's the identity that they're comfortable with. Others have been labeled. They've had an identity placed upon them by someone else. And some may live with and are known by an identity that they'd like to get rid of. It's become a burden to them. Sinner, broken, lost, failure. Or maybe you've been given an identity that would seem positive, but it too is like a burden. Perfect, always a success, mom or dad's favorite. Sometimes those so-called positive identities can be just as hard to live with as the ones we might believe are more negative. I've shared with you a bit before from Henry Nouwen's wonderful little book, Life of the Beloved, but in it he suggests that despite all the things the world says about us, all the labels the world may try and lay upon us, or the identities we've carefully manufactured for ourselves, or the ones we've earned rightly or wrongly, we are at the core of our being the beloved of God. Nouwen argues that like Jesus, who was claimed at his baptism as God's own beloved Son, we too have been claimed by God, and the greatest truth about who we are comes not from what we have or what we do or even what we failed to do, but the deepest truth about us is what God says about us. We are God's beloved. Maybe not in quite the same way as Jesus, but that is the most central truth about who you are. No matter what identity you've claimed or created or others have tried to impose upon you, you are first and foremost God's beloved. That's where we begin. And it's important because, as Richard Rohr notes, we can't begin a spiritual journey on a negative foundation. If we seek God out of fear or guilt or shame, we won't get very far in the spiritual life. We have to begin, Rohr says, with positive, with a wonderful experience, with something larger than our lives, by something that dips us into the depths of our own being, into the reality of who God says we are. And in fact, that's what the word baptism actually means. It means to be dipped into. It's what it means to be baptized into Christ. It's about finding our identity, about figuring out who we are by being dipped into the one who calls us beloved. Through the waters of baptism, God claims us as God's very own. Through these waters, we receive our most basic identity. Or better yet, through these waters, that most basic identity is revealed as all the others are washed away, and who we are becomes clear. Each and every one of us is created in the image of God to be children of God. Sometimes that image gets distorted or hidden, so baptism renews it, makes us whole again. Because in Christ, God is busy renewing and recovering that image that lies at the heart of every person. In Jesus, God is reclaiming you, reminding you of who you are, my beloved. Today and every day, God says, I have called you by name, and you belong to me. It's good news to know that we don't have to manufacture a life for ourselves, a story for our lives. We don't have to be who others think we ought to be. We don't have to try to prove our worth. We don't have to be forever known by our poor choices, our terrible mistakes, or even our greatest successes. We can be free to be who God claims us to be. And here, freedom isn't found in doing what the world says is worthy or valuable, and it's certainly not found in exerting my independence and autonomy and just doing whatever I choose or please. Freedom is found in knowing that we belong to a God who loves us, who redeems us, and will never forsake us, and who names us beloved. What a different world it might be if only everyone could hear this most basic truth. And if we could see this truth in each other. Talking about his ministry as a prison chaplain, Richard Rohr notes that after 14 years of working in the Albuquerque jails, he became convinced that the reason people often make great mistakes is because they've never heard what Jesus heard on the day of his baptism. They never heard another human being say to them, much less a voice from heaven say to them, "You are a beloved son, you are a beloved daughter, and in you I am well pleased." Friends, if we've never had anyone believe in us, or take delight in us, or affirm us, call us beloved, then we don't have anywhere to begin. There's nothing exciting and wonderful to start with. So we spend our whole lives trying to say it to ourselves. I'm okay, I'm wonderful, I'm great. But even then it's hard to believe because the word needs to come to us from someone greater than us. That's the primary role of parenting. To communicate to our children that they are beloved. That they're an eternally existing child of God. It's also the mission and ministry of the church. Rohr goes on to say, our prisons and jails are filled to overflowing with people who never heard this foundational message. And sadly, so is much of our world. And that gets expressed and lived out in all kinds of horrible ways. When we're baptized, another story begins, or we become aware that we're already part of a bigger story, a better story. And when we become aware of that, a whole new world and all kinds of opportunity opens up for us. Our calling as followers of Jesus is to live into that better story and to live from that better story. Some days that's hard. That journey of becoming who we are. Some days those old identities, they pull on us. But then that's the lifelong journey of the heart, the journey back to God. The journey to becoming most fully and completely who God has already said we are. The daily journey of saying no to other stories and voices and saying yes to the only story and the only voice that matters. It is a lifelong journey of grace through which we discover what it means not only to be God's beloved, but to live as God's beloved. In other words, to live like Jesus. And that finally is the only purpose of the gospel and even religion, to communicate that one and eternal truth. Once we have that straight, nothing can stop us and no one can take it away from us, because it is given only, always, and everywhere by God. And the mission of the church then is to try to replicate and resound that eternal message of God to everyone, everywhere, because it alone initiates everything good on this earth. You are God's beloved. What if we approach 2025 with that in mind? That DUMC will be singularly focused on living and sharing this good news to everyone we meet. You are God's beloved.